Okay, welcome to Lecture 2, our numerical example on the gains from trade. And, we'll end this one up with an example that demonstrates this and talk a little bit about implications for trade policy to get us ready for the next section. So this model starts with it's two country, two goods, right? That's what we talked about in the last lecture. And so you have the reading for this if you prefer to read it. I'm only talking about this alpha land, beta land example. But I'm trying to talk through just the basics of it, and if you wanted to read it, you can as well. So you get two goods, F and M. Think of those as food and manufacturers, or food and maybe machines. And this is the production possibilities frontier. And it says that you could make any combination on this line or inside of this line of food and machines. And they are currently choosing to produce point B. So they make 20 units of food, 30 units of machines. And then we track the PPF, the line between the two that says they could make, if they were to specialize in only making food, they could make 50 units. And that means no units of machines down here. And if they only made machines, they could make 50 units, but they would have no food. Beta land is different, okay? So a key result or a key factor for getting gains from trade is that this line looks different than this line, okay? So the second country in our model is beta land. They have a current production plan that says make 32 units of food and 4 machines. And in specialization, or in producing only one or the other, they can make 40 units of food with no machines, or 20 machines and no units of food. Okay, and so that is all of this down here. And so the question then is, how would you describe relative prices or opportunity cost of making machines, right? We need some way to price this. The reason to go to a two goods model is to get into relative prices, because that's what's going to be important for comparative advantage, and that's what's going to be important for identifying the gains from trade. So what would be the cost of M? Well, or the cost of F, either one. But if we wanted to make an additional machine in alpha land, right? So we currently make 20 units of food, 30 machines. We want to move to 31. Well, I don't think it's difficult for you to see that you would move over here to 31 and you would lose 1 unit of food. So the opportunity cost of making more machines is 1 unit of food. Now we need something to compare that to in beta land, and so we could do that, and we could say they currently make 4 machines. What if they needed to make 5? Well, if they need to make 5 units, then we move down this line and we are giving up food units, and it turns out it would be 2 units. And so however you want to think about it as the terms of the price of making machines in terms of food, you can do that. You could turn it around and think about it in terms of the price of food in terms of machines, right? So if I want to make more food, I move in this direction, and getting to 21 units cost me a unit of machines. Up here, moving to 33 units of food only cost me half of a machine, right? Because in this country, it is relatively cheap to make food in terms of machines. It's relatively expensive in alpha land to make food in terms of machines. By the same token, so if it's relatively cheap to make food in beta land in terms of machines, then it must be the case that the other country has comparative advantage in making machines. And we see truly that to get 1 more unit of machine only costs 1 unit of food. To get 1 more machine here costs 2 units of food, so it's relatively expensive in this country. So food is cheap, manufacturers are expensive, and we've said nothing about absolute advantage. But if you were to compare absolute advantage, you would note that alpha land is big. It can make 50 units of food. It can make 50 units of machines. Those are bigger than either one of these, right? So it is either it's a combination. They have more resources probably, but they also have lower cost in terms of converting those resources, one would think. And so they probably have a lot of absolute advantage sort of embedded here, but we're not really talking about that. The point of the trade is going to be, the point of the trade result or the trade proof is combining the two countries, getting them into exchange for these two goods is going to expand opportunities for both countries. Okay, so how do you sort of start proving this? Well, you pick up one of the axes, or one of the sort of graphs. You pivot it, I guess, what is that, 180 degrees, and you overlay it. And so now we have this corner being this right angle here being the beta land measurements, and this one here, this corner up here now becomes the origin for alpha land analysis. Okay, so alpha land makes more food when you move in this direction, more machines when you move in this direction. Beta land makes more machines when you move in this direction, more food when you move in this direction. Okay, so why do we do that? Well, because then the entire length, this is now what we call a box model or an Edgeworth box model. This full axis gives you all of the production possibilities, the total quantity available between the two countries of making machines. And then the vertical, whether you measure it on this side or this side, gives you the total quantity available for making food. And so if you add these two together, you see that 32 and 20 is 52, 30 and 4 is 34. So that's the combined current output. And then the question becomes, if they deviated, right, from these 2 points where they cross, where they currently produce, could they make something else? And well, it must be the case that if they can make any combination, right, they can make all of the lines down here, all of the lines here, and so there's a set of intersections of intersecting lines in here that controls this entire space. There's a combination, a way. If these countries suddenly became one country instead of two different countries, everything inside of this box is now an opportunity or a potential production combination. And that is why we say we look for this unshaded area and we say this is the potential gains from trade. Okay, so these things will cross, these two production possibilities frontiers, when you overlay them like this, will always cross at their current production choices. And then everything down here in this unshaded area represents gains from trade, because these are now opportunities. Once they start exchanging, these are combinations that they can make together, but they couldn't make on their own, because they're in isolation. They have to be on the, alpha land has to be on this line or to this side of it. In isolation, beta land has to be on this line or inside of it. If they combine, they can make the stuff in here. Okay, and so those are the potential gains from trade, this entire unshaded area. Why do we call it the gains from trade? Well, let's pick apart the opportunities that exist. Okay, and so this line EGM is, this EGM line right here sits out there in that gains from trade area in our previous box model. Okay, so imagine a line that follows right down the production possibilities frontier here. So even though we're not drawing both together, we're moving that other box off, the top piece of this off, so that we can focus just on beta land here. But this line is now available in a trade model, and so what we have then is production at this point E, and that's where the country has chosen to produce. And if they're willing to sell, instead of consuming domestically in autarky, part of their food production, a part from E down to F, right? So you give up some of your 30, don't remember what it was, 32 units of food that you were making at point E, move down to F. Well, now you have enough food to exchange with Alpha Land, and that exchange for that country paying the price that they would pay domestically should move you all the way out to point G. Okay, so you'll now be getting more machines. So you less food, you take some part of your food and trade it, and you get this many machines, and you are now outside of your production possibilities frontier. Okay, so this is the limits on consumption and production when you only consume what you produce. When you make a trade, you produce extra, or you take some part of the food that you made, you sell it, and if they pay the full price in the other economy, you would move all the way out to G. Okay, so you're paying for those imports with these food items. So your consumption is outside of the production possibilities frontier, and that is enough. I mean, that is enough to say that the gains from trade move you outside of what is consumable and producible in your country by yourself. Getting to point G is how we talk about the gains from trade. And there's a utility argument to be made, the idea that consuming more is better. And if you need that, I think the next slide will probably talk us through that. And it just says that if you want to complete the proof, not essential, but if you wanted to complete the proof, forget the point E and say that, okay, under a trade regime, we would probably produce even more food in beta land, all the way up to this point EF. And so now when they make their trade, they will drop the food that they're going to trade will be this amount, and then they'll trade it off for the machines at the same rate, right? So you get the same result, just shifted up to here. And then what that proves is that you're consuming, if you draw that line in, I really wish I had a drawer right now, but draw a straight line down here and then a horizontal line over to here, and it should match up, and it should show you that there is a combination under the trade regime where you consume just as much food, right? Because now the amount we're trading, the amount we're selling for export, takes us from this line E prime down to E, which was our original consumption of food. So we haven't lost anything in terms of food consumption, and then we're gaining all of this E out to G. We're gaining all of these machines, okay? And so it says that we haven't changed the utility coming from food because we're still at point E, and as long as utility is positive when we get more of the machines, then things must be better. Okay, we must have a higher utility. The implication of that is trade is utility increasing, trade is income increasing, and only requires that countries have different trade-off values for these. If two countries look exactly the same, then there are no gains from trade. They don't intersect in interesting ways. Okay, well, the implication then is if the gains from trade look pretty good when you take countries' current production plans like this and overlay them, what would happen if you thought about a country becoming a complete specialist in one thing or the other? And so the smaller country here becomes a specialist in food production, and instead of trying to make machines, which are expensive to make in their country, they make food, and then they trade it, extra food, to get machines from the place that can make it cheapest. Okay, and so you end up with this kind of picture. So it's kind of like taking the old graph and just pushing it out to get maximum aggregate production. So 38 and 12 is 50, 24 and 16 is 40. That's as far as you can get in the production of combined food and machines. And so you end up with food production and trade from one country, and you end up with this bigger slice here of unshaded gains from trade area. Okay, and now where does so what does that mean? Well, Alpha Land is still bigger, so they're going to make all the machines they need for trade, all the machines they need domestically, and they'll still have resources left over where they may produce food. So they may not completely be importers of food just because of the size of the country. But they're the only ones making machines. They're exporting it. And Betaland is a specialist in food production and trade. Okay, so this is a 2x2 model. This is called two countries, two goods. And you get this sort of clean, pretty specialization result. You add a third country and adopt the notion that they have to be relatively cheap at making something, right? As long as they're different, as long as they differ in some important way in terms of cost of production and trade-offs, and they should, right? Then they'll have a place to make trades, and then a fourth country, a fifth country, and so that's why you see, large countries make a lot of goods. Smaller countries tend to have this sort of export-dominated specialization, focused on either the resource base, either sort of labor, or if they have some sort of natural resource richness that they may work from. Okay, so what's key here in the results? We have this unshaded line, unshaded area. These are all the gains from trade. So in theory, trade policy should all exist out here. Negotiations on trade should find the combination out here, and there could be some market power in trade. That's one of the things that people look for and get concerned about: a small country versus a large country. How much sort of power can they exert? And that's why two-country trade is not as sort of favored as regional free trade. So you try to get 3 countries, 4 countries, many involved, not only because it sort of dilutes market power, but also because it leads to more goods specialization and lower cost, right? So every time you add a country, you add a specialist. You add somebody who has a relative cost benefit in the trading system. Okay, and so the gains should go up proportionately, and the only sort of losses are in the market power that may have happened in bilateral relationships. So it's from that point inside of here, it's all sort of game theory. What kind of strategy can be employed? And of course, these gains are out here, and it's possible to have a bunch of trade policy and tariffs that work out here but don't erode all of the gains from trade. So as long as product still flows, there should be some net gains. Okay, and so you'll actually see a lot of sort of food exporting third world, or I guess it's called developing world countries, that are food exporters in their region will tend to tax their exports because it's a good way to raise revenues to run the government. It may be very hard to tax internally the informal economy, but taxing things at the border may be very efficient. Not efficient exchange, but efficient in terms of trying to collect revenues. Okay, so that's where we get all the results about trade. It's where you hear economists sort of line up behind the idea that free trade is good, because you get this result, all these possibilities for exchange that are better, and inarguably better for each country under the assumptions here, and then expanding out to Gamma Land and everyone else in the Greek alphabet only multiplies these because you get more dimensions. Okay, so why do these things exist? Well, countries differ in their resources, and so every country is going to have some difference in terms of what it is sort of higher cost in production, or what is more scarce, or what technology is more limiting. Countries have different demands, maybe for derived demands for production, but also just final demands, cultures, other institutions that may, religions that may sort of drive, that may be good at production of something, but not have a lot of internal demand, and so it could be very valuable as an export. Goods have multiple technologies, and so choosing among those may be limiting in some places and not in others. And then, of course, the key thing is the resources tend to be immobile. Okay, if you do have this densely populated country with lots of labor, and this other country that has lots of land for agricultural production. Well, one option would be to trade some land for labor, but it tends to be hard to move land into another country. We tend not to hand over space in our country, and we tend not to allow this sort of mass movement of people. And so this sort of fixity of resources tends to drive trade, because the way that you can make trades on abundant labor or abundant land is to trade the products that are relatively cheap to produce because of abundance. Okay, and so the way that we trade land is by producing excess agricultural products above the domestic need and then export those. And so the value of land as a production input gets exported. It's called the factor content of trade. They're factors of production, and every time you buy something, you're not just buying the product, but in terms of economics, you're paying the rewards to those factors of production. So just like in a country or a village or a city, you have some people that run bakeries, and some people buy from bakeries using money that they maybe did at their architecture job and all of this other stuff. Well, we have resource differences. Some people are good at baking, and some people make the investment in ovens, and some people are good at architecture and design the buildings. And so the economic exchange is something that we look at all the time and think about it sort of being the resolution of resource differences. You're good at one thing, do it as your sort of occupation, and sell those services, and then take the income that comes from those and buy the other things that you can't make on your own. And so we think of that all the time for ordinary agents, and so trade is just expanding that out to the country acting as an agent. So just a few discussion points. If we were having class, we would talk through this. I'll just say what I think about a few of these, really to get to the last point. How general is the theory? Well, there's certainly, anytime we can put something in pencil and paper or graphics, there are going to be complicating mechanisms. And it's certainly the case that we may have these resource criteria met, comparative advantage here versus comparative advantage in another country, and not have a relationship with that country that fosters trade, or the belief that continued trade would be good. So there's diplomacy and sort of just non-economic factors, right? So, historically in the 20th century, for the last half of it, the United States and Russia, two big countries, two big economies, didn't trade a lot, even though there were all kinds of gains to be made from trade, mostly because they had big differences in political ideology, and the sort of nature of the relationship between those two countries was conflict, even though it was called the Cold War. And so you miss out on the gains from trade there, because strategically, getting dependent into a trade relationship with a country that is hostile can be a problem. So that's one that gets missed. It's a complicating mechanism that has to be sort of filtered through this, and think about sort of where do we promote trade policies. And it's certainly one that comes from the policy side that economists are not specialists in and have difficulty with. So the recommendation then becomes, to the extent as possible, pursue free trade, but it's always going to be constrained by sort of what is possible in terms of, the sort of other strategy of the country that doesn't depend on sort of national income. Some geographic issues may be in play. In theory, we should be able to account for those in the costs, but geography and climate as sort of a combined thing may introduce a whole set of risks that are very difficult to incorporate into this type of theory. How complete does specialization happen in practice in the world? Well, you can look at, it's not common to go looking at trade statistics over time and find a lot of countries that bounce back and forth between being an exporter sometimes and an importer sometimes of a product. And that's about as complete as you could think. And so when people talk about globalization and sort of the impacts, that may be what they're talking about, the idea that you don't see a lot of import versus export year to year. This year we're a net importer, next year we're a net exporter. Those tend to hold up. And so, it's fairly complete in that regard. We do not see, though, that countries leave behind the production of something, and it's just not practical in a world where we have brands and varieties and quality differences, especially in food markets, and every place in the world makes wheat. The wheat of one country is not the same as another, right? Even if and sometimes it is. There are very little qualitative differences, but there are all kinds of varieties, all kinds of differences that may be there, and certainly in terms of strategic food production, most countries try to maintain some domestic production capacity in staples. Okay, if you talk about this sort of specialization and gains from trade, how do you think of a policy like Buy American or labeling or sort of promoting that? Well, I'll just say that it's sort of second order protection. I think the next talk you have in this module is from Milton Friedman, and he's going to basically say that when you promote one thing, it is a form of protection. And so it would not be the case that sort of Buy American fits into a aggregate income increasing economic policy. It would have to be aligned with some other strategic goal, right? That says we are willing to give up some economic gains to increase domestic purchases, right? To increase the use by the domestic population of production that happens domestically, right? So the economic argument would say just let the gains from trade work out. Who cares where it was made? But economics is not the only driver of policy. And one of the reasons you may do that is distribution, right? So if you Buy American, you may be promoting an industry, right? And you may be promoting them at high cost to some people, right? So the consumers may be paying a higher price, and the country may be losing out on sort of aggregate income gains, but those aggregate income gains may only go to a few industries, and they may not be spread out into the labor force. And so when you see what we might call the sort of anti-free traders, or the domestic production, or Buy American, Produce American, those kind of things, they're mostly talking about sort of the distribution. The comparative advantages say that you make these trades, you end up out in this area, and it must be the case that Alpha Land has more total income in the country, or products consumed, and Beta Land has more than they would if they just stuck to what is here. But what is not captured out in here is, what if there was, in this specialization, there was somebody who owned a machine factory, or somebody whose primary skill is working in machines. Well, now they're going to have an income loss because they're going to be forced to move into food production. They can't move easily over to Alpha Land and earn their same income that they were. And so it's a distributional cost. So even though the aggregate gains are there to show that the country as a national agent is better off, it turns out that the distribution of that income maybe is not. It's almost guaranteed that the distribution of that income is not going to be made in a way that guarantees everyone an income gain, right? And some people will lose. And that is another area where policy has to come in and decide how much economic trade-off are we willing to take in terms of the aggregate, right? And are those people who would get those gains, the largest gains, if we do pursue this trade, are they going to be able to take some of their gains and make the people who lose as well off as before? or should we just counteract that and say let's impose some protection to keep these industries protected and keep people's income? And that is the big sort of flaw in specialization. Comparative advantage trade theory is the distribution, and and it's also the thing that sort of slows down globalization and increased free trade, is the fact that there are losers, and as you get them more concentrated, they will be able to resist more because they will have better political influence, and that's the topic we'll move to next.